I thought I would film this from the beginning and just not necessarily as a workshop on a how-to, but to share with you the process of painting without a technical lesson. It was a painting that I was working on and I was really enjoying the process, and then things happened. Months went by. Actually, it was closer to a year, and I pulled the painting out and I decided I really didn't care for it anymore. I wasn't feeling it, so I wanted this canvas. It's a large canvas, so I gessoed over most of it. In this area back here, it was a mountain scene, it was a lake, and I really hadn't put much on the bottom other than some thin glaze. I was just working with it. Most of it was the mountains and the rocks. I had rocks and some plant form there at the top third. So I've decided I'm going to paint something kind of organic, stone. I love painting stone and rock, and as you see, again, my typical clay stones are in this one as well, with some sand and some small rock added in. And I use the elastomeric. You can use acrylic paste. And so I've applied this with my palette knife, and I also sprinkled some sand while it was still wet. And before I did that, I laid out my composition, and so I just drew these shapes, these forms, these lines, and I'm not really 100% sure where it's going to take me. And so I wanted to share this process, and of course I'll share some technique. As I'm working and this painting starts to develop, I'll film bits and pieces and edit it together for you and share this. So it's not going to be like a workshop step by step. And so let me take the pooch out, and then I'll work on this over several days and film it in progress for you. Before I begin the painting process, there's a little bit of information that I want to go over with you, starting with my color palette and the media that I've included, as you've seen so far on the canvas. Usually I would go over that first, but I decided after I had applied the media to the canvas that I wanted to share this with you. So there's a few tutorials I have on the website that I'll refer you to in a little bit, and you can watch those and see how I applied the media. So my color palette, to start, I've decided to go with Quinacridone Nickel Asso Gold here, and the Cadmium Yellow Light, the Dioxazine Purple, and I'll be using Payne's Gray to tone down the colors a little bit. I may use the opposite, the complementary, to do that as well. And I'll be using gesso to tint my color, and use all of these colors in color glazes, as well as some opaque layers of the colors. Now, if you want, you can use titanium white versus gesso to tint your color, or to use as a white glaze, which I'll be applying later. What I did was I messed around with these colors because I tend to like the toned down jewel colors in my paintings versus straight out of the tube. And so what I've done is I've used the dioxazine purple to just a small hint of it to tone down that quercitone nickel azo gold, and I like that a lot better. It's not as intense. And then again, I added a hint of the purple to the cadmium yellow light, and I got this kind of muted green, this neutral green I like, and it really goes well, I think, with the brighter, lighter green I created with the yellow again, but with a hint of Payne's Gray. And I got this green because Payne's Gray has this blue undertone to it. And so the blue and the yellow, of course, made a brighter green. And I really didn't care for that really saturated purple. It was a little bright for me. So what I did was I toned that down with a hint of the Payne's Gray. This also pulls these colors together, so you see that they just look really nice together. That's called color harmony. So we're going to apply that throughout the painting. The Elastomeric Custom Patch Smooth. I find this in the hardware store. The major hardware stores carry it. Lowe's and Home Depot carry it. It's in the painting department, actually. And then I have some coarse sand and some air dry clay stones, various sizes and shapes that I made. Always make a large batch of these because I use them in a lot of my paintings. And then here's some small pieces of stone, different values in them. Okay, so for this mixed media painting, we use an acrylic paint and then what you see here. I mentioned earlier a few tutorials on applying this media, being that I decided to film this after it was applied. I have several YouTube tutorials. They're somewhat old but very beneficial. So go on acrylicandmixedmedia.com and click on the Techniques and Materials page. And then scroll down just a little bit to acrylics. And then you want to scroll down to the bottom. And you'll see my YouTube videos. And the first few to come up is a tutorial. It's a 3-part tutorial for a painting titled Well Balanced. But the first 2 parts of this will benefit you as well for this painting. The first tutorial is going to cover how to make the air dry clay stones and how to apply the paste or the elastomeric to the canvas. Like I said, this is an older tutorial, and I had used some lightweight joint compound by Sheetrock. I would recommend the elastomeric or acrylic paste. It's more durable and flexible. And so watch that tutorial and how to apply that media. And then the second tutorial is going to cover a technique I'll use in the project, in this painting project coming up, where I'll paint the media up, apply the texture with Payne's Gray, and then lift that paint and leave the paint down in the crevices of this texture, which will save you a lot of painting time later. Now, this is a small canvas, so in the tutorial it's placed under the faucet. In this painting, if you're painting a large canvas as I am, then you can just paint sections and lift it with the wet sponge. You can do that for small canvas as well. You don't have to put it under the faucet. So those are the 2 main tutorials I suggest that you watch so that you will know how to apply this media and then lift that paint later, because this is not your typical step-by-step tutorial like a workshop or one of my printed tutorials. This is a spur-of-the-moment video on the painting in progress. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Okay, I've changed a few things. Reshaped a little bit. Took some of this area down. Have some more space in there so I can work with some depth. I really, really enjoy creating depth with texture, so I'm starting to feel really excited about this. That's a good sign. I reshaped in here a little bit, worked that area. So I really want to get my composition, my lines where I want them to start. And like I said earlier, those could change. I've just changed a few. But before I really get into painting, adding more color to this, you know, I really wanted to work on where I wanted the main lines to be. I left from the old painting some color. I scrubbed it back and left, of course, the stain there. I like that stain from the previous painting. These are textured with some of that stain. I really like that. I have some crackle in here. You can see I really want to keep that. That's going to be really hard to do because I already have paint in those cracks that I really wouldn't have done as much as you see there, because I've gessoed over a lot of this too. Scrub back, gessoed. So, you know, I'm going to see where it goes. That there's a lot of really wonderful texture that I'm gonna play with and see what I can do with it. Here's really some sand, some coarse sand, and it's got some beautiful deep purple. The oxazine purple, I believe, is what I used, and I want to keep that. I'm just going to go with it. It's just calling me, this canvas and this vision and the stains I'm leaving behind. So that's where I am right now, and I'm going to paint on this a little bit. I'm going to play with it a little bit more, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to show you what I've done. So next time you see this canvas, who knows what it's going to look like. So here you're going to see that I have used the Payne's Gray to paint over all of the texture that I added, including the lightweight air dry clay stones. And I'll let that settle for a minute or two, and then I'll take a wet sponge, a kitchen scrub sponge, where it's sponge on one side and a little scrubber on the other side, and water and a damp or a wet sponge, and I'll lift it. This is why I wanted to seal these lines, because here's the first stage of scrubbing and lifting, and that gesso and those dark lines would have been lifted as well, and I don't want that. Okay, now I have lifted the majority of the Payne's Gray paint, and you see the paint has been left in the crevices and lifted from the raised areas. So this gives it some extra depth, plus you want to paint down in those crevices so you can take care of this right away. You can see why it was important to seal this air dry clay with the liquid polymer medium. So I'm going to work on this some more and start working some color. Oh, and by the way, when I was lifting some of this stain, I went ahead and I took that diluted, when I was lifting some paint, I went ahead and took that diluted Payne's Gray that was real runny, and I used it as a stain, and I wiped it over the white gesso. As you can see, this stone now has a grayish undertone, and still some of that color is peeping through, so you don't see that real white gesso that you were seeing earlier. So if you want, and you want to lighten some areas in your painting, then you can go ahead and use white acrylic paint or gesso, and then take some diluted Payne's Gray once it's dry, and just wipe over a real light diluted layer of it, and you can let it dry and then do it again. I've got this area down here I haven't done yet, so I'll do the same through here. But up through this area I did, and you can see the difference. It's really calmed that white down. Okay, at this point you should notice that there's a little bit more depth starting to develop. What I've been doing is applying a thin inky consistency of some glaze. I mixed some of the quinacridone, nickel azo gold, and the purple, and just a hint of the purple to it to darken it some. And then I added in water to an inky consistency, and it came in some areas where I wanted the darker glaze, like through here, just touches of a little bit in here, just a few areas where I wanted to create a little bit more depth. And at the bottom, I want the painting darker at the bottom to kind of frame it in and keep the viewer's attention, move it back up. Because of this line here, I just don't want it to just take the eye totally off the canvas, so I've framed it in somewhat, and I'm going to be adding in a lot more detail in lines to take care of that issue as well. And then once the glaze dried, I went in, I added some of the dark glaze a little bit over here as well, and then I let that dry, and then I diluted some of the gesso, and I added a hint of the purple and a little bit of the Payne's Gray. And this is what I'm using, and I'm using a wet brush, and of course I'll pull off of that, and it'll be like a glaze between the inky in some areas if it's real dark, and then more of a heavier consistency, a cream consistency, where I want it even lighter so that it's more opaque than the inky consistency. And what I've done is I've added that to where the color can still peek through. It's not totally opaque, it's more between transparent with the inky consistency and then the heavy cream consistency, maybe a little bit thinner than that, is more of a kind of a translucent versus opaque. And then there are lighter touches of opaque, not much. I'll be adding more opaque as my final detail later. But that's what I've been doing with the gesso mix. And what I'm doing is I'm hitting some areas where I want it to be lighter. Some areas I want that glaze to peep through, and some areas not as much. So I have that down. I'm letting that dry at this stage, and when that dries, and it shouldn't take long, what I'm going to do next is come in and apply some inky consistency of Payne's Gray and put some shadow under these stones, these larger boulders rather. Put some shadow in there, but I want the color underneath, some of it to peep through, and it's going to be very little. And then I'm going to come in these areas where I applied the texture, and what I want to do is start with a creamy consistency, kind of a semi-opaque, and then come in with just Payne's Gray and apply some of that where I really want it opaque. And what that's going to do is create even more depth, and it's going to bring those stones those clay stones forward. And of course I'm going to be painting those stones or staining them and adding more color to the stones later. But that's what I'm going to do next. So now I have a thin glaze under each line, which again will represent shadow. I went in and I applied it also under that top stone, on the side of the stone, and under each line, because those lines represent the bottom of the stone or the boulder, the large pieces that set on top of the one under it. In the areas where I applied the texture, I'm going to put a few additional layers of this glaze, and then I'm going to come in with some of the Payne's gray, and without diluting it, and create even more negative space. And I'm going to do that throughout this area where I've added the texture, and in the areas where I drew in some stones versus these are actually drawn in, painted in, versus the clay stone. Okay, so I'm going to do that next. Okay, I'm back. This is what I've done. I've added 2 to 3 layers of Payne's gray glaze in the creviced areas between the media, and then I used a damp paper towel to lift some of the glaze from the raised area, because I've decided I want to bring some root down in this area, and that's where I'm going to be applying some green, more green, on this ground area, and then I want to bring it down, flow down. I'm going to do this on both sides, and then I want to bring it down into this area, and then let some of that root drop down in here. You can see where I raised, excuse me, I lift the paint off the raised area. Now I used a damp paper towel, and I rubbed and lifted some of the Payne's gray and purple glazes applied, and I worked in a circular motion in the shape of these stones, these clay stones. So I lifted some of my glaze, and I had some additional stones created, which really gave it some depth, and they look like they're further up in this hole between these stones. And then applied a light glaze over top of them, and I'll be applying more glaze on top of these clay stones in the foreground. Where that texture is, I wanted to save in the beginning at the top of the canvas. I'm thinking what I could do with that is have that as perhaps some foliage from a tree, a branch overhead at a distance. And I think I'm going to develop some more sky, definitely. Maybe some stormy sky coming in, some clouds, and a lighter color through here, some bright clouds maybe at a distance, and then put some gray, maybe some hints of purple up in there at a distance or at the top. I'm not sure yet, but I want to develop that sky, and I think I want it to be some storm clouds coming in, but a brighter cloud area above that center stone up there, to create more depth and some nice contrast. And so what I'm going to do next is to go in with some color glaze and shadow in more of the stone and have those transparent colors create some more depth. Just a little bit of color. I don't want to put a lot of color over the stones. I want the stones light. And I think when I develop those cracks, I'm going to be bringing in a lot of more Payne's gray lines. When I come back over these shadows that I added in earlier, and then some more cracks along these stones, I think it's going to really come together. So that's where I am at this point. So I'm going to add some color glaze and maybe add some root, some of the green I talked about, a little moss, maybe some grass up in this area. And then I'm going to put the main cracks or the lines that separate these boulders stacked. I'm going to bring that out. It's going to really create some depth and shape. And then I'm going to come back and show you that, and then develop that sky in the back, that stormy sky I'm seeing that I want over this with a branch hanging over just on the left side, maybe a little bit of green down this side of the stone as well to bring in some color harmony in the painting. I may even add a few twigs up here. I'm seeing maybe a couple of twigs in here that have maybe fallen off that tree branch hanging over. And I'll be right back. Okay, I'm going to stop here with applying the glazing of the quinacridone nickel azo gold and the dioxazine purple mix. I don't want it to get too muddy or dark value. And now I think I'm going to go ahead and work with some white semi-transparent glazing, or maybe a little bit thicker mix for more opaque and some highlighted areas. And then I'll come back and we'll see what happens, and then I'll move up to the sky. Okay, I've finished applying the gesso glaze, and I've lightened up some areas. I've cut back some of the medium value that I had acquired with the glazing of the azo gold and the purple. So I'm gonna stop there and add in some cracks next. Now at this point you'll notice a big difference. I've applied many layers of color glaze and staining. And before I go any further, I do want to discuss the difference briefly between applying a glaze, a color glaze, and a stain for those of you who are beginners, because I've used both terms and I don't want it to be confusing. A color glaze is where you apply a transparent layer of color over top of a dry layer so that you can see through that layer to the dry layer, whereas a stain is a highly saturated color applied, and then it's lifted and it leaves behind a stain. And I've used both techniques here. Also, what I've done is I used my smaller liner and applied a few cracks in my stones, and then of course I applied the color glazing technique with the purple and with some of the Payne's gray and the nickel azo gold. Also what I did was I tested the green mix as you can see here. And I like what I'm getting. What I did was I applied a thin color glaze, and I lifted some of it with a damp paper towel so that I had several values of that same color. And then I came in with a heavy cream consistency and applied even less, as you can see. And I'm liking what I've done so far, so I'm going to continue with that, but only after I finish the sky, which I've yet to really work on. But I wanted to test that green and see how it was going to work out for me. I really love what I'm seeing. So also I'm going to work the green in this painting because I need some color harmony. I just don't want green down the center and along the top of the stone. So I want to add it through my painting and bring all those beautiful colors together. And so what I've decided I'm going to do is really play on that textured sand area and use it to my advantage. So what I'm going to do is apply some of the green as a stain and lift it, and then come back and dry brush lightly over the texture of the sand, and it's going to appear kind of almost like moss, and I really love that. And I wanted an organic feel with this painting, so I think that's really going to pull it together. So I'm going to apply the green in areas like you see here with the sand, and there's right much of it placed throughout the painting. And then I'm going to bring the roots, continue to bring those down, and they're going to end about here, and then work that green. As you can see, I really added some depth with that Payne's gray. So what I'm going to do next is work on this sky, and then once my sky, my clouds are in, I'm happy with that, then I'm going to work this area up here with this sand and put some green in that, like a branch and a few some foliage, and a few branches are going to stick out from that. I may add a little bit more green in this area, I'm not sure, but it's the bottom of a tree, like a branch just hanging over. And of course the branches I'll bring out up here will pull the eye back down in this direction, and I'll probably put a few twigs like I mentioned earlier and use those lines to guide the eye as well. I'll be using the medium round and of course a damp paper towel in my fingers to paint clouds as well. I really like the results I get with that, and it's fun. And then this upper left corner where the branch will be, I'll be using the medium round and the larger script liner brush to paint the branches coming out, and perhaps some twigs in this area. I may include the small liner as well. I wanted to touch base with you on a few things that I've changed. I was going to work on the sky, and it was just after I'd finished the moss and the roots, and I wanted to go over that with you, but something just didn't feel right. So what I've done, the changes I've made, I've added a larger round, an old round, a raggedy round I had. You can use any brush, and I did some stippling basically. What I've done is I've added some sap green because I really wasn't getting the dark green that I needed with the lighter green. When I would add more purple or the Payne's gray, it was really muted and muddy, and I didn't like it, and it just wasn't happening. So I added a sap green to my palette. I like that a lot better, and I came in with my brush and basically just stippled in over that sand over the lighter green for some shadow, just a little bit. I didn't want it to overpower the moss area. And I had finished my roots and they were like really bright coming at me, so I glazed over some of the root with the Azo Gold and toned it down somewhat with the purple, and glazed over the root to calm the green down. And then I came in with some sap green and touched up some of the root to give it some depth and shape. And as you see here, I added more shadow to some of the stone. Just stood back and looked at it and decided, you know, where I needed a little bit more shadow, and I used glazing of the purple and the Payne's Gray mix, and added some depth and some shaping. Then I took the Azo Gold with a hint of purple, and I glazed under some of the stones at the top. I'd say the top half, maybe 2/3. And just some areas skipped around, and it gave it a little bit more depth and some color harmony. It just pulled that painting together using those lines. And so I wanted you to see what I've done so far. And I'm actually moving up to the sky next, but I didn't want to cover all of this plus the sky at one time. So I want you to see where I am, and I'm actually moving to the sky. And then I'm going to set this painting aside after I show you the sky and just think about it for a few days. And I've noticed through my camera that I'm really not catching the shadow that's actually on this painting. Let's say I aim close up. When I pull further away, you really can't see the depth as much because the painting is very large, so when I pull back, you're really not seeing it. So I don't know, I may add a little bit more shadow, and I know that I want some in this area on this stone right there, that where those two connect. I want to shadow that a little bit more, and maybe some other places for movement. When I went over these cracks, I mixed the sap green and Payne's Gray, about a 50-50 mix versus using just Payne's Gray. And this time when I went over the cracks, I went over just the deepest part of the crack with this mix, not the entire crack, because I didn't want that coloring book kind of look to it. So when you go over the cracks for final detail, just go in. I want to find an area that will show up on this camera. Just go in the area that you want the deepest in that crack with this mix, and leave some of those cracks faint where there's been layers of glaze applied over them. I'm actually working on the sky for real this time. But before I cover that, and there were a few areas I needed to repair on the sky area. But before I go over that, I continued to add a little bit more glaze and some stain in some areas that I wanted to create even a little bit more depth. And then I wanted to shape up some of those stones and brighten up a few areas. I wanted to stay light, but not too light. But what I mixed was a golden color using a 50-50 mix of a little bit of cadmium yellow and some Azo Gold. Mixed that and then added a hint of that into some gesso. I thinned the gesso down to an inky consistency and glazed over a few areas, and then applied it a little bit thicker, maybe heavy cream consistency where I wanted it a little bit more opaque. I also worked on these cracks a little bit more with the 50-50 of the Payne's gray and the sap green. Applied it where I wanted, again, it to be deeper in any areas of the crack. Not the entire crack, but just the area of that crack where I want it the deepest, because that glazing covered some of those cracks. So I touched those back up. And then I went up to the sky here and I had to make some repairs. This section here was this big blob of texture, and it had to go. I wasn't going to put a branch there. I just want that one branch above with some stems sticking out. So I needed to remove it. It just wasn't working for this painting. It was overbearing. So what I used was an old palette knife that I have from college. That thing is so sharp, it's like a blade now. And I use it still as a tool. So what I did was I mist that area, let it absorb some of the water, and then I scraped that texture and lifted that texture. And then I applied some of the matte medium over the canvas area, just in case if I had weakened that canvas some, and then applied some gesso over it. Nice thick layer of gesso, and I dipped my palette knife in some water and smoothed out that gesso. In this area as well, I needed to lift. I had this vertical 4 or 5 inch straight line from that stone up into the sky, and it didn't matter how much gesso I put over it, it was still showing, so it had to be removed. You can see that line where it was lifted off the stone there, which doesn't matter, I'm going to paint over that. And I lifted a little bit of the texture on the right here. So that's where I am. I'm definitely going to develop a gray stormy sky and then apply some nice bright clouds, and especially on the horizon back there in the area above the center stone. And I'm hoping that's going to really push the rest of this stone structure forward even more. And then after I develop that sky, I'll come back and show you what I've done, and then I'll go from there, adding that branch and some twigs up there. I've also decided that I may come down here and paint in some twigs at the ground level, and maybe some sticking out of some of these stones where they've fallen, and a few laying on some of the stones that are overlapping. I'm not sure, and I may add a little bit more of that golden glaze. I just want to wait and develop the sky and see if it's needed. I think at this point I'm happy with the sky area. Other than a few highlights I'll come back and add to the clouds. I'll add more white and just a small hint of the Payne's gray and highlight some clouds. And then add a touch of the golden, light golden yellow to this area of the sky where I want it to appear as though the sun's trying to burst through these rain clouds. But before I go over how I got this effect with gesso versus acrylic paint and why I chose gesso versus the paint for the sky, I want to cover a few things. And you'll notice that I added in the branch, and this branch is that of one of those raggedy looking pines or cedars that tend to grow along the East Coast. As you leave the beach and head towards the mountains, they flourish even more, and those two areas are not that far apart. And I live between the two, so I grew up seeing these type of trees, and they drop a lot of twigs as well. And they grow in high acid soil and they love the rocky turf. So I thought that this type of foliage would be appropriate for this painting. Also, you'll notice that I've applied a darker green. I added sap green to my palette. I just wasn't getting the dark green that I wanted, that I had from my paints. I was just getting a muddy color and I didn't like it. So I added sap green, and that's what I painted that branch with in this moss. So I came back over my moss and I stippled in the sap green. I let that dry, and then I had two values, a medium and a light value of the green that I had previously used. So I stippled over some of the medium value over the sap green. I let that dry, and then I simply just dry brushed the lighter value over the raised texture of that sand, and that's how I got that effect. I also applied more of the Payne's Gray glaze, a little bit more, and develop those stones, the shaping and shadow and depth, a little bit more there and throughout the painting. And I added some of the nickel asso gold with a hint of Payne's Gray glaze and applied that to the root area. There was just too much green going on, and I wanted some color harmony to bring the right side of the stone to the left side of the stones in the painting, and that pulled them together, and it also united this area as part of the whole painting. Now the twigs, I had mentioned painting in some twigs. I put a few in. I didn't like what I was getting with those lines because I've already applied so many cracks and roots to the painting that those twigs just created more chaos and too much movement, too much distraction, and they really didn't complement the painting. They weren't necessary. So I think I'm going to apply a few here at the top of the stone, as you see, and maybe pull some over to the center area here. And that's going to be pretty much it for the twigs there. I've also applied, wherever I applied the glaze, I would work it throughout my painting, including these center stones for more depth. And this golden yellow I tested that I'm going to be putting in the sky as well. I'm going to apply more of that to the stones to add more weight and shape and some color harmony, and pull that up into the sky. I'll apply it more to the top stones and lessen it as I work down. Now that's pretty much what I've applied so far. Getting back to the sky, the way I got this effect is, of course, you saw the base coat of the dark gray. I sealed that because gesso lifts easier than acrylic paint, and that's the reason why I chose it for this technique to get my sky like this. I could do it with acrylic paint, but it just takes a lot more time and work, and I just love the effect and how quick it is to get it like this with gesso. So I sealed my base coat of the dark gray color, and then I let that dry. I chose the matte acrylic medium. You can paint with, you can seal it with either a satin glaze or the matte acrylic medium. The reason why I choose satin or matte is because the high gloss can distract you for this application. It can trick the eye into thinking you have a lighter area when it's just a reflection. So it's very distractive to me. So that's why, and that's the only reason I chose to seal it with a lower sheen. All right, after I sealed it, I had mixed a medium and also a light value of that same gray. I used a damp paper towel. I didn't use a brush at all to develop these clouds. I used a damp paper towel and applied the medium value of the gray mix throughout the sky and I used a clean, damp paper towel, and I lifted that in areas. I lifted more where I wanted larger clouds and less as I worked down to my horizon. And I used a circular motion to lift it. It lifts a lot easier and has a different effect to it than acrylic paint. So most of this is lifting as well as just applying a little bit with a damp paper towel versus painting and painting layers and layers to get this effect. So I let that layer dry, and then I came in with a clean damp paper towel and applied the lighter value where I wanted to develop the clouds. So I had 3 different values of that gray. So I'm going to seal this and then come back and highlight and add that golden yellow up in the area of the sky I mentioned previously, and maybe pull a little bit of that yellow in this area under these branches. Add a few more twigs and then come in with that golden yellow and continue to apply it to the stones to create more color harmony and add some weight and interest to this stone area. I'm going to apply less and less as I work down because I want that shadow. That's pretty much it. I'm going to do that and come back and go over that with you. And that's going to be my final detail. Then I'm going to set this painting aside for a few days, maybe even a few weeks, and come back and look at it with a fresh eye. And if I like what I see, I'll seal it and sign it. If not, I'll make those changes. I think at this point I'm happy with my results so far. But like I said before, I will be setting this aside for a few days, maybe a few weeks, and observe it and see if there's anything I'm missing, because I'm just not seeing it at this stage. It's easy to get really absorbed into your painting, and you want that to happen, but sometimes you just do not see the obvious in front of you, and then later you look at it and you're like, why didn't I see that? So I'm going to set my painting aside and make any changes. I'm sure there'll be minor if there's anything. But I want to go over my final detail, what I did. As I said I was going to do, I went in and added a hint of Payne's Gray, very little, to the white, and highlighted my clouds and added a touch of yellow, the golden yellow I used on the stones as well, into the sky, and that really pulls the sky and the stone area together as a whole in the painting. And I pulled some of that over and applied it just under these branches. I darkened and shaped the foliage a little bit more with some of the sap, and also the branches I added a little highlight, just a little bit lighter value than what was on there to shape those branches somewhat. And I added some twigs there on top of the large stone, and one hanging over that center stone pulls the eye back down, balances the painting well, I think. I removed some of the roots from the smaller stone. It looked kind of star-shaped. I didn't like the direction they were going in. And I also applied some of the light golden yellow, as I mentioned earlier I was going to do, and it really shaped these rocks up. It really pulls the colors together. It looks really nice up against that grayish color background and on the stone. Some beautiful contrast up against the dark green. And I applied a little bit more glazing, color glaze, mainly Payne's Gray, where I still wanted to shape my stones or shadow some areas, and applied less of the golden yellow as I moved down because I wanted it darker at the bottom where there was less light. And that's pretty much it. That's what I've done. I did want to cover the sky area. I forgot to tell you this earlier, but that those streaks coming down representing rain, all I did was when I was creating the sky in the first place and applied the lightest value, I simply took the same paper towel, damp paper towel, and gently rubbed those streaks in the direction that I wanted them. It's real easy to do. And I highlighted the clouds in the background, the small ones mainly, where I wanted to develop them and give them some distance and pull the stone even closer to the viewer. And that's pretty much it. I've enjoyed sharing this with you. I really hope it has inspired you, and the tips that I provided, I hope it helps you with your future creations.